Okay, now that we've talked about independent groups design, we need to talk about within groups designs. Within groups designs, remember, within groups means that each level of the independent variable is given within the person, right? Within the group. Each person gets all the levels of the manipulation. So for example, in the stress and anxiety test, each person would take the easy test and the impossible test, and then the impossible test with somebody watching them. They would do all of those things. Now, there's two main kinds of within groups design. The first one is concurrent measures. Concurrent measures is not always possible. Concurrent just means that you would be exposed to all the levels concurrently at the same time. Now, for our example, that really wouldn't work because you can't take an easy test and an impossible test and an impossible test with being watched all at the same. That doesn't make sense. You can't do all three simultaneously. Normally, something like a concurrent measure is often done with attitudes or opinions about things. So, for example, if I wanted to, if I was doing a marketing research on new cars, and I want to know whether or not you like the Honda Civic better than a Hyundai, I don't know my cars, right? So I want to know whether you like the Honda better than the Hyundai. What I would do is I would show you the Honda and the Hyundai at the same time and ask which one you prefer, okay? Within groups, because you, the participant, are being shown two levels, Honda and Hyundai, right? Those are the two levels, and you tell me which one you like, right? They're concurrent, they're happening at the same time. If that was an independent groups design, you'd show half the people the Honda and say, how much do you like it? And then the other half, you'd show the Hyundai and say, how much do you like it? And then you'd say, you'd look at which group liked it more. Concurrent within group just says, show each person the Honda and the Hyundai and say, which one do you like better at the same time. The much more common kind of within groups design is the repeated measures. In that one, what you do is you are exposed to a manipulation, a level of the manipulation, then you take the dependent measure. Then you're exposed to another level of the manipulation, then you take the dependent measure again. And then the last, as many levels as you have. So for example, with us, with our example, what it would mean is that you would take the easy test first. Then you take the anxiety scale. Then you take the impossible test. Then the anxiety scale. Then you take the impossible test while you're being watched. Then the anxiety scale. All right? Repeated measures. In this case, the measure would be the measurement of the dependent variable, which is the anxiety scale. And it repeats after every level of the manipulation. Now, when you do repeated measures, you have to worry about order effects. Order effects means the order that you present the levels of the manipulation matters. It could be problematic. So for example, let's say that you had the order of take the impossible test first, then the impossible test plus being watched, then finally the easy test. Well, practice effect would just mean, hey, you're practiced at taking this test over time, and so taking it the first time might lessen the stress the second time. You become more practiced at it, right? So there's actual experience with the manipulations that could affect the way that you respond. It would be quite different if you took it for the first time. So the practice effects means there's something about practicing that changes. Maybe it lessens your stress. Maybe it makes you able to respond more quickly. Maybe it's just a practice idea, right? But either way, the order that you take them in is going to matter. Another example of an order effect is the carryover effect. So let's say that you did what we just talked about. Let's say that you took the impossible test first. Well, the impossible test was so stressful for you that you took it impossible while you're watching. Then you're so stressful that when you take the easy test, you're still stressed out. And that stress then changes your anxiety. Okay, that would be a carryover effect. There's something carrying over from one thing to another that you didn't intend to. It's not that you practiced, right? It's not the amount of practice. There's something about the experience that carries over into the next level of manipulation, even though you didn't intend it to. So when you're doing a repeated measures within groups design, you need to make sure that you counterbalance the order. You can't have everybody do easy, then impossible plus being watched. You can't do it that way because there might be practice effects, there might be carryover effects, there might be some other things you don't intend. One way to do this is to have a full counterbalance. The counterbalancing in this case means the order. You're counterbalancing the orders. So there's different orders that people could take this in. They could do easy, then impossible, or easy. So it could be easy, impossible, then impossible plus being watched, or it could be easy, impossible plus being watched, then impossible, or it could be impossible, then impossible plus being watched, then easy, then impossible, then easy, then impossible plus being watched. You see the orders that we're creating right here? A full counterbalancing would mean that all of the orders, so every participant would take it in each of the separate, okay, so all the participants total would have gotten an equal number of orders, right? So participant 1 had one order, participant 2 had another order, and all the different orders, and then you would have an equal number of the orders that they could be presented in your entire group, okay? Not that each person has to take every single order. Each person only has to do the 3 levels, but the order that you presented in has to be balanced between all the different participants. A partial counterbalancing is when you can't do all of those. There's so many different orders that you can't quite do that. You do a partial counterbalance. So for example, you might make sure that a third of your participants get the easy test first, and a third of the participants get the impossible test first, and a third of the participants get the impossible test being watched first, and then whether or not they get the order of the other ones doesn't matter as much. But you want to make sure that each group, each level is presented first for an equal number of people in your study. There's a fancy way of doing this which actually presents a relatively equal number, but it's technically partial, which is called a Latin square. I'm not going to make you know how to do a Latin square. Just know that it's a partial counterbalancing technique for within groups designs, and it does a good job of balancing the orders, even though it's not a full counterbalancing. Nobody really does those anymore. I mean, it's really pretty rare. So just know that it's part of a counterbalancing measure, part of counterbalancing the orders. All right, remember when we talked about validities in the past: construct validity, internal validity, external validity, and we also did statistical validity. But let's talk about these 3. In order to maintain construct validity within a study, one thing you can do is a manipulation check. So we talked about doing construct validity for the measures, but we really haven't started talking about construct validity for the manipulations. Because if you remember, construct validity is the relationship between the square and the circle. Okay, here's the stress, right? And we changed it by giving the test, the 1, 2, 3 different conditions, right? And then we had a measure over here, which is the anxiety scale. We've already talked about the measures stuff I think it was chapter 5. So now we need to talk about, what about construct validity for the manipulation? Construct validity for the manipulation is, does the way we manipulated stress actually manipulate stress? And so in order to do that, one thing you can do is a manipulation check. Remember, this is the hypothesis that stress causes anxiety, right? But a manipulation check would say, hey, have everybody take the manipulation and then have a stress measurement, like a scale. And what you should see is that if the easy test is really less stress, then the people who are in the easy condition should show less stress on the stress scale. It is not the dependent variable. Notice stress is the independent variable. Anxiety is a dependent variable. The only reason why we're measuring stress is to make sure that our manipulation actually changed stress. Internal validity is making sure that stress is causing the change in anxiety. That's internal validity. And the way that we can maintain that, probably the best way, is to make sure that we have random assignment. The other way, by the way, is to cut down on any other confounds, right? Make sure that we're controlling for any confounds that might be happening. But random assignment can make sure that it wasn't the medication that's causing a change in anxiety or something else, right? We need to cut down on the confounds too, but random assignment takes care of all the unsystematic variability that we might get. External validity is, how well do these results apply to the outside world, outside of this study? One great way you could do that is with random sampling, but in reality, random sampling is not as important in an experiment, because if you randomly assign then any of those factors should be equal in the three different groups. Random sampling is not as important as assignment in a study. Now, you might say, hey, but wait a minute, aren't we using all, mostly white college students, and therefore they don't represent the population? Well, if you think that stress would change anxiety differently for college students than they would for other people, then maybe you can make a case for that. But in general, if you're saying, hey, we manipulated stress this way, and we happen to use college students, but we randomly assigned, and so all those other factors, like their race, their religion, their hair color, their political affiliations, that was all randomly distributed among our groups, so that the only real thing changing it was the amount of stress. If that's the case, then you have a pretty good indication that it's the stress that's causing anxiety, and it did not particularly depend on what kind of participants you had. Random assignment is more important than random sampling. If you can do random sampling, good for you. But for an experiment, random assignment is much more important. All right, now let's do some examples. I don't know if you remember, but we went through some studies earlier in an earlier chapter when we first started talking about experiments and correlational studies. So let's start with the Festinger and Carl Smith 1958 cognitive dissonance study. This is the $1, $20 study. Here it is. All right, a few questions. Number one, was that an experiment? Yes, it was. That was definitely an experiment. What was the independent variable? The independent variable in this case was the justification, right? The thing they manipulated to change the independent variable was the $1 or the $20. So the operationalization of the independent variable was giving $1 or $20. There were no other independent variables. No other independent variables. What was the dependent variable? The dependent variable was the liking for the task, liking for the original task. It was the dependent variable because that was what was being measured. It was the outcome, right? The justification should change the outcome, which in this case was the liking for the group, right? Okay, whether you had sufficient or insufficient justification depended. All right. Why did they have everybody? Why did they have everybody lie to the experimenter? What variable was lying? Okay, now this is tricky because that is just part of the study, right? Them going through that lie, everybody did it. It was not a manipulation, okay? It was not a manipulation. It was just part of the study. It was just part of the study because they needed everybody to experience a certain amount of dissonance based off of what they did, right? And they changed the amount of justification based off the amount of money they gave. And that was manipulated, right? Because we had a comparison group, $1 or $20. But whether they lied, everybody did. And so that is not an independent variable. It's not a dependent variable. It's not a manipulation check because it's not actually measuring how much justification they felt. It's none of those things. Is this independent groups or within groups? This is independent groups because the person either got $1 or they got $20. There was nothing within groups there. They were in one or the other group. Okay, now let's look again at the power balance test that we talked about before. So go ahead and watch this. Okay, so the independent variable. What is the independent variable? The independent variable is the presence of the power balance bracelet, right? Okay, it's actually the presence of that hologram, right? What's the dependent variable? In this case, it's balance, right? How well you were able to keep your balance. That's the dependent variable. Is this an independent groups or within groups experiment? This is a within groups experiment because the participant got both levels of the independent variable. The independent variable is the power balance bracelet, right? So they either wore it, that was one level, or they didn't wear it, that was the other level. There was a problem with which one of these? There was a problem with practice effects, which is a form of order effects in this study. Okay? There's other problems that are going on there, but practice effects specifically because they always did the order the same way. They always did it without the bracelet first and then with the bracelet second. So what happened is they were always practiced whenever they were having their arm pushed down. They had more practice the second time, and so they could withstand it better. The practice effect was a problem. Now, would that practice effect be systematic or unsystematic variability? That would be systematic because it was in the system. It's the way that they performed the study. It's systematic to the study. Which one of these is an example of unsystematic variability? So unsystematic variability is all the characteristics that we normally have that could affect your balance. Now, the problem with this is that we really don't have any problem with unsystematic variability because we did a within subjects or within groups experiment. So the fact that Cola was buff, right, and he was a good athlete, it wasn't a problem. It wasn't a problem of unsystematic variability because he had to do it with the power balance bracelet on and with the power balance bracelet off. So his buffness was the same. It was controlled in both levels of the manipulation. That was not an issue. The unsystematic variability, that was not an issue in this particular case. Not a problem at all. Would we use random assignment in the power balance experiment? Random assignment is only used for independent groups designs. It's assigning you to a level of the manipulation. It would be assigning you to either wear the power balance bracelet or not wear the power balance bracelet. You would do one or the other. You'd be assigned to a level of the manipulation. That would be random assignment. Okay? And that is different than random sampling. Random sampling is how we get people to be in my power balance test at all. That would be sampling. Sorry. Sampling is how you get people to be in the study to begin with. Assignment is once you have them in the study, how you assign them to levels of the manipulation for an independent group's design. Was this concurrent or repeated measures? This was repeated measures because they either had the bracelet off and then they pushed on them or had it on and then pushed on them, right? They repeated the measure of balance, which is pushing on his arm. All right. Thanks, everybody.